Of course. And welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining me today. We're going to talk about tailoring communication to build trust. So if you're attending with us live, thank you. If you're happen to be catching the recording, that'll be posted on my website or my YouTube channel. We're going to record this webinar and then it'll be available for folks to be able to watch at some point in the future if they wish. So for those of us who are attending live, please have your mobile device close by. I'm going to use some online polling software to ask you questions, and you're welcome to answer those questions anonymously. We might also ask a few questions in chat, so make sure that if you feel safe to express anything there, you're welcome to. I always like to begin these presentations with a quote, and I found a quote by an author named Charles H. Green, and it states, "It takes two to do the trust tango, the one who risks, the trustor, and the one who is trustworthy, the trustee. Each must play their role," right? And when we think about tailoring communication, there's a lot of different things that we have to be mindful of as we're thinking about and going into those things and kind of establishing trust and making sure that we're participating in the tango, if you will. It really does matter tremendously. So quick little story background about myself. For the last 10 years, I've been a speaker, leadership consultant, executive coach, really in the business of guiding leaders and organizations through their biggest challenges and through transformation. And over the last couple of years, there's certainly been a lot of that. And I think the thing that I enjoy doing the most is really listening deeply and actively and trying to create safe places for people to be vulnerable or to develop that trust, if you will, and really give people a space to feel heard or accepted or safe, vulnerable, take those risks, learn, and really at the end of the day, become their true authentic selves. And so my mission is about unlocking human potential, right? And I believe that all persons really do have the answers inside of themselves, and we shouldn't be necessarily looking to celebrities or athletes or politicians for some of those answers. And so some of those things I'll share with you kind of throughout the time today, but also at the very end, I'll talk a little bit about a book that I just published back on January 1st called I Know. And there's a lot of elements of what I just said in that book for sure. My personal brand is really about authenticity, right? I really don't like that society has been built upon projecting a specific image. I'm really about openly sharing all life's highs and lows and telling the whole of a human story. So you can see on the screen, that I've published the book. I Know some of the things that I've done recently. So thank you so much for visiting. If you ever want to visit michaelsseaver.com, again, lots of downloads there, 200 plus blogs, hundreds of media features. And on the homepage, there's a video slider that's where I keep some of these recordings and some of the other interviews that I've done recently for podcast or for something else. So again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. So in the next 45 minutes or so, what I want to talk a little bit about is basically the history of the DISC assessment, and I'll define those things and go into them in a little bit more depth, but then tie it back to how does that help us tailor communication, or how does that help us build trust? So I'm going to give you a little bit of definition of DISC and of trust, and I'm going to go through things that come from the DISC assessment in the organization that I partnered with to administer those. But there's also some material inside of the handout that I sent via email this morning, and that I will also resend later, probably today, possibly early tomorrow, as a follow-up from today's time together, so that you have access to that whenever it is that you want it. And I'll give you a process that I would suggest to my clients to make sure that they're really integrating this information into their life well for self-awareness, but also to genuinely make sure that they're doing the best that they possibly can to not only learn themselves, but also then customize or tailor their message to other people. So I've been in the business of leading teams almost now for just over 25 years, and I've served as an executive coach, leadership consultant for about 10 years. And I've had thousands and thousands of hours literally in the arena with people, understanding their hardships, the challenges, the things that have shaped them, and why they communicate the way that they do, or what are the ways that we actually get to find some sort of compromise, some sort of win-win. How do we deepen those relationships and build trust, really for the benefit of a long-term relationship? And those things do genuinely matter. So we'll go over those things in the next 45 minutes or so. But what I want to do is I want to start our time together with a question. So I want you to have your mobile device close by. If you have it, grab it real quick. I'm going to send you to another website where you can anonymously answer a question. And the question you see on your screen is, which personality inventories or personality assessments have you completed? So I'm going to launch this here, and you can see the options on your screen. So what I want you to do is, in your mobile device, go to www.menti.com, menti.com, And you can see the code there at the top center of the screen, 54793197. And after you've entered that in, there will be a series of questions that I ask you throughout our time together, but here's the first one. And so if you've ever completed any of these personality assessments, whether it's DISC, whether it's Myers-Briggs, maybe it's predictive index, emergenetics, maybe Enneagram, maybe there's another that you've completed. And if you haven't done one, that's okay. And you can submit multiple responses. So if you've done multiple assessments, go ahead and click on each of them. I just want to get a flavor or feel for the folks on the call today and what it is that you might have done in the past. And I'll try to customize and tailor a few of the things that I say to that. Okay, so we've got a relatively fair equal distribution for folks who have maybe done one, maybe done a few of these different types of assessments from DISC to MBTI. And there's one person on the call that hasn't done any yet. So maybe there's a way that we can help you with that. Okay, so relatively fair distribution of folks who have done a variety of these things for self-awareness to learn a little bit about their own communication style. And I think that's great, right? Because it really does help us to make sure that we know ourselves well, but that also then we can begin to identify those verbal and nonverbal cues in the people around us, right? And the real true power is in developing those trusting relationships, is about knowing ourselves, being able to recognize those things about the other people around us, and finding win-win resolution with them through different types of communication. Okay, so let's go back to the slides. I'm going to give you just a brief history of the DISC, right? And so many of you just answered that you have taken the Myers-Briggs. And so if you've ever heard the name Carl Jung, the Myers-Briggs type indicator was created by a guy named Carl Jung, who was a protege of Sigmund Freud. But roughly about the same time in the late 1920s, William Moulton Marston was working on the DISC. So Carl Jung and Marston were kind of working on the same ideas psychologically at the same time. Carl Jung's work ended up becoming MBTI, or the Myers-Briggs. William Moulton Marston ended up creating kind of the basis or the foundation of the DISC. And you can see in the upper right-hand corner, the book called Emotions of Normal People, which Marston published in 1928. Now, what I love about Marston is that he's a pretty unconventional guy. He ended up passing away in 1947, but throughout the early 1900s, he had a wife named Elizabeth, and he had a polyamorous life partner named Olive. And he had 2 kids with each of those respective women, and they all lived in the same home. Now, he was a Harvard grad, and he ended up teaching psychology at American University, Tufts University, and then eventually at the University of Southern California. So he had this really great background of being able to understand people through all of his research, but also through teachings. So not only was he kind of the founder in his psychological research and understanding the DISC, what we now know as the emotions of normal people, he also was the initial creator with his wife Elizabeth of something called the systolic blood pressure test, which later became part of the polygraph or lie detector. So this guy has been dabbling in a number of wonderful things, but he also really interested in comic books. And so Elizabeth and Olive and William were sitting around one day and said, why don't we find a way to take all of these kind of male-dominated DC comics and let's add in a female version, right, of a comic. And so what they ended up creating, and Marston was a very strong supporter of women's rights, is that he figured out a way to create and sell to DC Comics this idea of what we now know as Wonder Woman. Back then, she was known as Suprema. And it really, really is an interesting story how it all came to be. But William was such a content, kind of an integrity, kind of an honesty-driven guy that he and his wife and life partner ended up coming up with what we now know from Wonder Woman as the lasso of truth, because he was constantly focused in on how do we get people to be authentic and to tell their truth. So that's why Wonder Woman is who she is, or what it is that she focuses on. And it's so interesting to me that as life changes and evolves, he was able to find a way to kind of marry all of these disparate ideas and projects together in such a way that not only did he help psychological research and advance it in a really beautiful way, also contributed to the polygraph, also contributed to popular culture through DC Comics, right, which is pretty cool. So fast forward a number of years, there have been other people in between Marston and a guy named Bill Bonstetter, who you see on the screen, that have contributed to and helped with the growth of DISC, right? This understanding of the different types of communication. And I bring up Bill specifically because I met him a number of years ago before he passed. And he ended up starting in 1984. And you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, something called Target Training International, sometimes referred to as TTI Success Insights, or sometimes just TTISI. And so years ago, I became certified to use their assessments, from DISC to things, motivators, to emotional intelligence, to things around stress quotient, and then finding the right hires. And so what I love about TTISI is not only the history of Bill and the things that he has done throughout these years, but they have neuroscientists on staff that can basically secure and double check and quality check the validity of all of their assessments. And so they have 4 US patents based on various types of psychology to make sure that the inventories that people are taking are valid and really highly accurate for them. And they've been able to administer more than 30 billion of these different assessments across the world, 115 countries, 47 different languages. And I use the emotional intelligence assessment quite a bit with different clients and customers. And then also something called the 12 driving forces, which we don't address necessarily today. But in the chapter that I sent you via email this morning, there is a mention of the 12 driving forces as being the second tool that I use when I'm helping someone define their personal brand. So take a peek at that. So what I love about this material and TTI and the things that Bill started is that they really found a way to take the DISC theory and to take the DISC report and highly customize it to the individual, right? So they're able to do all of that research and do all of this background, get all of this data to know that it's highly valid, right? So throughout the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, it wasn't necessarily meant to be personalized by the person as well as it is today. So if you haven't done something from TTISI, I would really encourage you to do it. And if you ever have questions about it, we can talk about that after this particular webinar recording, because I want to make sure that you have access to that for yourself, but also self-awareness in a deep and meaningful way. So I just love the background or the history of the DISC because it kind of displays not only this push for equality and helping women secure a voice at a very high level, which is really important to me, but I also love that I've had the chance to meet Bill years and years ago, and I'm pretty strongly connected to his stepdaughter, if you will, and have a lot of time to be able to converse with her back and forth. So strong family connection there, and I really appreciate the work that they're doing to help people go through the process of self-discovery. So that's a quick history of the DISC. Let me ask you another Mentimeter question real quick, and then we'll dive down into the various things that we can do to make sure that we're customizing and tailoring communication. So the second question is, and let me get through this full question before you answer, is that when you think about DISC, there are 4 different parts, right? And the second part, the I, stands for influence. And there are a multitude of ways in which we influence someone to take our perspective, right? To believe what it is that we're saying. So on the left-hand side of the screen on the slider, you can see that sometimes people only use realistic facts, figures, and data to be able to influence someone. But on the right-hand side of the slider, some people prefer to use emotions and relationships and feelings, or being optimistic, right? So they're the opposite of data. So I want you to drag the slider to where you think you are in terms of how you influence people the most. Left, kind of on the lower side, using facts, figures, and data, or are you on the right, tend to use more emotion, feelings, and relationships? No right or wrong answer, just want to see how you feel. Okay, so for the folks on the call today with us live, it looks like we're leaning a little bit more towards using emotion, using feelings, using relationships, using optimism, right? Kind of close to the facts, figures, and data, but leaning a little bit more towards using connection and community and relationships first. Okay, so that's great to know. And if you have done some of the assessments, maybe you know this about yourself, but thank you for taking the time to answer that question. So the thing that I want to help you understand is I'm going to give you just a high level overview of DISC, and you can see a number of things on the screen that help to describe each of the specific pieces of it, if you will. But I'm going to try to give you a little bit of insider information as I look at it, right, when I'm trying to coach someone in their own way. So when I think about DISC, I first think about trust, right? And so trust is really about a set of specific behaviors or someone being able to act in a dependable manner, right? Operating with honesty, operating with integrity. And trust is also kind of like being able to forecast into the future and having a probability that someone's going to behave in a certain way. right? We have a feeling or a confidence to know that someone's going to do something that they say they're going to do, right? That's kind of a key piece of trust, if you will. And I always look at trust as being about self-awareness first, right? Understanding our own style, understanding how it is that we show up and interact with the world. But then the second piece of it is making sure that we're focusing in on how do we recognize others and their style, right? So self-awareness first, then being able to take our time over a couple of months to learn other styles and be really focused in on that. So then after you've had some time to ingratiate yourself to each of the respective disc styles, then all of a sudden you can start to really deepen and meaningfully form long-term relationships, right? It comes from a lot of intentional back and forth exchanges, but that's really through that give and take, that's where the best relationships do form. Now you can see on the left-hand side, the respective definitions of each of the DISRC styles. And so dominance is really about how someone deals with problems and challenges. And if you desire to follow along, on the handout, it's on page 6 of the handout that I sent this morning. Even if you're just going to check it out later after we've done with this particular recording, page 6 is kind of the start of this particular piece from our discussion on the handout. But what's important to kind of reference here is that, again, no right or wrong style when it comes to someone having a specific disc profile. But what I want you to think about, I guess, as we're going through some of this description, is to think about one person, like bring a person into your mind right now that you might be struggling to communicate with, right? Just think about who he or she is, his or her name, not anything that you necessarily need to share with us, but just bring him or her into your mind. So as I'm going through these descriptions, I want you to not only be able to categorize yourself if you've forgotten what your style is, but I also want you to make the best guess that you can at what his or her style might be. And then that will help us as we go through the remainder of our chat. So D, dominance, really about how do we respond to problems and challenges. And so you see on the left-hand side, the brief description, and you can see on the right a little bit more of a chart that's vertical. And you can see, again, problems and challenges in the red section for D. And so a person who happens to be quote unquote high D is that they have a number on the assessment that's above that medium line, right? So about the 50% line. So imagine at the very bottom of this chart is a 0, and at the very top of the chart where it says aggressive and optimistic and predictable, that's a 100. So as people are above the 50% line or above the 50 line on any of these charts, that means that they're a high, whatever that is. And so in this case, a person who might be a high D, right, it says there that they are aggressive, right? They tend to be driving, they tend to be bold, they tend to be pioneering. They tend to like to make decisions really quickly, and they tend to like to make decisions alone. But if a person on the D chart is a little bit closer to the bottom where it says reflective, they tend to be a little bit more agreeable, they tend to be a bit more cautious, or they tend to be a bit more peaceful. So again, think about yourself. Where would you fall on that particular chart? And then again, think about the person that just came into your mind that you might be struggling to communicate a little bit with. Are they more the aggressive, driving, bold, pioneering type? Or are they more the peaceful, cautious, agreeable, reflective type? Just being able to draw a dichotomy between yourself and that person is the point of this activity. So now the second one, I, stands for influence. And you can see on the left, it's how do we influence people in contacts to your point of view. And we just did the question on Mentimeter, and I think we were almost at a 7 for our audience today, that we gravitated a little bit more towards being focused in on optimism. So a high I person, right, so above the 50% line, if you will, they tend to be optimistic, they tend to be inspiring, they tend to be focused on emotions and feelings, and they tend to be very sociable, right? They love social relationships and conversation, which is amazing. But if a person happens to be a lower I, right, so closer to where it says realistic at the bottom, they tend to be a little bit more pragmatic, a little bit more objective, a little bit more reflective, if you will. So again, think about yourself. Where is it that you might fall on that chart or that scale? And then think a little bit about where is that other person that is in your life that you would like to communicate with just a little bit more. Okay, so now the third one, the S, stands for steadiness. And you can see on the left-hand side, steadiness when it comes to communication and psychology is how do we deal with pace and consistency in our life. And so a person who happens to be a higher S, where it says predictable there in the green section, they tend to be a little bit more logical, a little bit more patient, a little bit more systematic, right? So they like an even flow to their day, if you will. But towards the bottom where it says driving in the green section, they tend to be a little bit more intense, a little bit more adaptable, flexible, and a little bit more excited as we go through life. So be thinking about yourself, where would you fall on that chart, and think about the person that you brought into your mind that you want to make sure you're communicating a little bit better with. Where would that person fall on that particular scale for yourself? And the last one, C, stands for compliance. It's really how do we deal with procedures and constraints, rules and regulations. And so a person who falls a little bit closer to the high C, right, they're very precise, really meticulous, and they really like to follow rules and regulations. They like the implementation, they like the creation of them, they like to be able to help other people follow them, if you will. But for those people that are really low on the C when it comes to those procedures and constraints and rules, they very much see the rules as being kind of a guideline or a gray area, right? They're much more fearless, far more unconventional, much more pioneering. And so when we look at the dichotomies between the high and the low of any of these respective styles, again, not a right or wrong answer, and each of us is going to have a different chart, if you will, but it's important to recognize that each of these respective styles does have overt kind of observable communication cues, if you will. So we can always recognize what a person's style is based on the various things that happen in their life, from the things that they say to the tone of their voice to the things that they do non-verbally. And so throughout the talk, I'll try to explain a few of those things kind of as we go, but want to make sure that you have a good understanding kind of the basics of that so far. So do you have any questions, anything that has popped up so far that I can help you with, or are we still in a good place? Okay, so I'm gonna take that your silence is that you don't have any questions as of now, and that's a-okay. So again, definitions right there. These are also defined, I think, on page 6 of the handout that I sent over this morning. So you're welcome to get a little bit more information there. And at any point in time, you're welcome to reach out to me via email, and I'll happily explain more information about this with you or to you. So, okay, so what I want to do is dive down into 10 different areas of kind of those verbal and nonverbal cues to help you feel really safe and good in understanding not only your style, but also somebody around you. So on this particular slide, I've laid out the DISC styles, and you can see them with the same color as what you saw on the previous slide. But what I've done is I've gone through it and broken down a couple of different things that I'll explain as we go through it. But what I want to do is kind of start our discussion with, again, a little bit of a focus on trust. And so when we think about trust in relationships, right, it's really being able to predict what someone else is going to do, or possibly what situations might occur, right? We want to be able to try to prepare for some of those possible threats that might exist. How can we surround ourselves with people that we trust? How can we create a present that is really safe and good, but also allows for us to predict a little bit of the future? So what I want you to do is look at the DISC styles on the screen and help to kind of think not only about yourself and how might you predict your own behavior, but how might you be able to predict the person to communicate with just a little bit better. So in the upper left-hand corner in the red box under dominance, I put a couple of sections called action orientation and environment orientation. And what those really mean is action orientation is that for extroverts, right, they're very proactive. So in the upper left-hand corner, D, dominance, they are extroverts. They love to be able to take action. So at the end of a really long, hard day, they're the type of people that's going to be proactive to go get things done. Now, the great thing about people who are D on the DISC profile is that their brains are hardwired in such a way is that they view themselves as being more powerful than the environment around them. Right? So they really believe in their heart of hearts that they can control the things that are happening to them, right? And that they can control things that are happening around them, whether it's other people, whether it's circumstances. So if the person that you identified as you struggling to communicate with happens to be a higher D, right, on the DISC profile, just be aware that they like to take action, right? That's a thing that is really interesting for them. And they view themselves as being more powerful than the environment, really meaning that they think that they can control it, or that they have some sort of action that they can take to control it. Now, the environment orientation is really about task versus people orientation. So a person who is high dominance, they love to complete tasks. They love to get results, right? So when it says task orientation, that means that they have a long checklist of things that they want to get accomplished, and they do an absolutely beautiful job of working really long and hard to make sure that they complete all the tasks on that list. Now, the one thing about a person who's high D on the disc is that they view the world around them a little bit antagonistically or a little bit unfavorably. So there's that little piece of their heart that thinks that the world is out to get them, and they need to control the environment to try to mitigate some of the risks associated with what might be happening in their world, right? So just be mindful of that as we're thinking about the various things associated with these styles. Is we want to be really mindful in a really powerful way to make sure that that we are recognizing these things. And a great question just came into the chat was that, are these things consistent throughout life? And that's a great question. So thank you for submitting it. And the answer is no. There can be adjustments or changes depending on really significant events in a person's life. So most of the time, a person's DISRC style is going to remain the same. It's going to remain consistent. But I have seen numerous instances where if a person goes through a really traumatic event, there can be a change, let's say for 3, 6, or 9 months, where their style of communication does evolve or change. But then 3, 6, 9 months later, they do the assessment again after they've dealt with the trauma or gotten through that situation, and they're back to their quote unquote original style. So most of the time it's going to be the same, but sometimes a person's DISRC style can evolve or change if they've just gone through a really hard psychological event. So great question, and thank you for asking it. So the high I in the kind of yellow box in the upper right-hand corner, just like the D people, they are extroverts. They like to take action, and they also view themselves as being more powerful than the environment. But when you are with a person who's a high I, right, they love to be able to have fun. They're very collaborative, and they try to create groups and group interactions and fun ways for people to get together. So you can always recognize a high I person by the style where they're trying to get people together, right? They're the ones that create team cohesion, or they're the ones that create the after work events, if you will, so that there's opportunities for people to get together and talk. And the reason why, right, is under environment orientation is they're very people oriented, and they really view the environment around them favorably, right? They think that the world is their oyster and that the world is meant to serve them and do good things for them, right? Which is a strong juxtaposition against the red box, the dominance folks, where they view the world a bit unfavorably. So the influence folks, they like to take action, they're extroverted, they love to create fun, they love to create group interaction. And it's because they're very people oriented. They spend a lot of time in relationships and learning from relationships, and they really do view the environment around them favorably. Now the S folks, the green box in the lower right-hand corner, steadiness, right? These are the folks that really like a consistent pace to their day. They're a bit more introverted, right? They tend to, when situations arise, they're not the type that's going to be proactive. They're much more reactive, right? They wait for circumstances to occur. Part of that is that they view themselves as being less powerful than the environment around them. So they wait or have a bit more patience in waiting for some circumstance to play itself out. But there's that tendency for introversion is to do things alone, or not be in groups, or to be asked, if you will, to be able to do something. So if you know of a person that's like this, we might want to give them just a little bit of space, give them a chance to kind of think through some things before we actively try to involve them in something. But just like the influence people, right, they're very people oriented, and they view the environment around them favorably, right? So these folks are absolutely great at creating engaging environments inside the workplace. They, in some ways, can kind of be like the glue that holds a team or a group or a not-for-profit or something like that together. So it's great to have the steadiness folks on the team. Now, on the left-hand, lower left-hand side, the box, the compliance folks, I happen to be a high C on the disc, so the blue box in the lower left-hand corner as we go through these slides is really describing me, if you will. And so I happen to be an introvert, right? Those folks that are high compliance, those ones that like to follow the rules and really live by policies and procedures, they are also introverted. They tend to be a bit more reactive, right, when it comes to circumstances that are surrounding them. And it's because they believe that they're less powerful than the environment. So they tend to wait the same way that a steadiness person would. Now, the same, even though they're the same as the steadiness folks and being introverted, they have similar characteristics to the high dominance people in that they're very task oriented and they view the world around them unfavorably. So the right-hand side of the screen, they view the world very favorably. They're very people oriented. The left-hand side of the screen, really task oriented and they view the world unfavorably. So just be mindful of that. So again, no right or wrong style, but it's just recognizing your style and the style of the person that you would like to communicate with a little bit more better, and understanding some of the things that drive his or her behavior, right? So if we're an extrovert and the other person's an introvert, that's going to cause a little bit of a rift because one of us wants to take action and the other doesn't. Or if one of us is people oriented and the other is task oriented, the task oriented folks just want time uninterrupted to be able to complete and get results. Whereas the people oriented folks would rather have conversation. They would rather sit down for lunch. They would rather have a drink after work together and get to know one another. So recognition of those underlying things that help us really do help us to make sure that we're adjusting our style to them. So I'll do another one and then I'll pop up a question. So when we think about DIS or C, I want to look at the things that motivate each of those respective styles, but also their fears. And the fears piece is a really big piece for me because it's probably what I spend the vast majority of time on today, especially since COVID started, basically a year ago, almost today. I spent a ton of time helping people through fears. And so it's important that you pay attention to this part, just because if you're feeling it, that's great, but I can guarantee you that people around you are also feeling this in some way too. So when we think about trust and building trust in relationships, part of that's emotional, part of it's logical, right? When it comes to the emotional component of building trust, it's about how do we expose our vulnerabilities and finding a way to believe that someone else is not going to take advantage of us. But the logical part of our brain when it comes to building trust is that we have to logically assess the probability of gain or loss by sharing information with a person and try to logically conclude, is this person going to take advantage of us or are they not? Are they genuinely going to help us? So there's always this logical and kind of illogical or irrational component when it comes to the communication piece. Now in the upper left-hand corner where it says dominance, right? People who are high D on the DISC profile, they tend to be motivated in a way by power or authority, winning some sort of a competition or maybe having some new challenges. So if I'm coaching a person that is either a high D or has a high D on their team, I always want that person to be given more problems to solve, right? There's a challenge inherent for them that they really genuinely enjoy getting results, finding resolution, and making sure that they solve a problem and then can move to the next one. So if you have a person in your life that happens to be high D, they love to be able to solve problems. So they feel fulfilled, they feel good when they have a chance to be able to do that. Now, the challenge with a person who's a higher D or high dominance is that they really do fear vulnerability. Now, in the last slide, I talked a little bit about control, and I talked a little bit about them wanting to make sure that they could kind of control the environment to make sure that they didn't have to express vulnerability. Well, it's because they fear it. And the way that we can help them feel safe so that they don't feel like they've lost control or that they're not being taken advantage of is we can constantly make sure that they're updated with sufficient or good information. Right? We don't ever want to keep information from a high dominance person. We want to make sure that they have all of the information so that they feel safe. Because if they don't feel safe, eventually they're going to get to the point of frustration or anger. We want to mitigate that, and the way that we can help those folks is to make sure that we give them opportunities to solve problems, but that we also do a good job of giving them sufficient information so that they can do their job well and not feel that someone's going to take advantage of them. Now, with the influence in the upper right-hand corner, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, these folks are really people-oriented. So they love the idea of social recognition. They love to be a part of group activities. They love friendly relationships. So whenever I interact with a high influence person, I want to make sure that they're given opportunities to lead teams, right? Whether it's some sort of an employee engagement initiative, whether it's some sort of marketing or sales initiative, or something that is like a happy hour type thing after work, virtual or in person. They love to be able to organize bringing things together. And so that is a really key piece or part of this, is making sure that they're given chances to do the very things that motivate them. Now, you can see the opposite of the motivation is their fear. And so someone who's a high influence, they don't really like being ignored. They don't like losing influence, or they don't like being rejected socially. But one of the ways that we can help them feel just a little bit safer through those things, if they do happen, is to make sure that we give them tons of words of encouragement or talk about the other things that they've done that have been really helpful or good. So we can't always avoid the social rejection piece, but the way we can mitigate some of the stress or risk associated with that is to constantly make sure that they're aware of the benefit that they've offered to the organization or to the team or to the person in a really good, meaningful way. Now, in the lower right-hand corner, the steadiness in the green box, right? Those folks, they're very people-oriented, they're very introverted. So they're motivated by really stable environments. They like to be in a cooperative environment. They love to be able to help people. I said just a minute ago that they're kind of the glue, if you will, that holds teams together. So we want to create opportunities for them to support team engagement, right? It doesn't matter what it is within your department or team, but it's just that they have a chance to be the glue that reaches out to various types of people, finds a way to get them involved and accommodate their answers of the things that their opinions, right? They're the things that they want to contribute to a conversation. So the thing that we have to do with those folks that are high steadiness is that they fear change, right? They fear loss of that harmonious work environment, or they fear loss of stability. So the way that we as leaders or friends can help them is that we have to be very clear when we communicate that we are giving them, here's the step-by-step plan of what's going to happen in the next couple of months or whatever the process is. So if we want to help a steadiness person feel safe, we want to make sure that they have the plans. They know what's coming next. That's an important piece. Now, if you happen to have a person in your life who's high compliance in the lower left-hand corner, again, those task-oriented folks are really introverted. They love to be able to share their expertise, and they're really great with attention to high quality and detail, but they're finishers. They like to be able to complete projects. So one of the ways that we can keep them engaged and motivated is to have them manage details, right? Have them check others' work, have them close out a project, have them double check a spreadsheet or double check some sort of written piece. They love to be able to use their expertise in a way that benefits the team. Now, they fear being criticized or they fear being wrong. So we want to make sure that if they've done something wrong, we find new ways to be able to share with them that there was a different way to do it or that they made a minor mistake. And so we constantly want to give them chances or opportunities to express themselves, right? These introverted task-oriented folks, those high C compliance folks, they tend to not share a whole lot about themselves. And so one of the ways that we can help them overcome some of those fears is to ask them a lot of questions about their life, what it is that they're working on, the things that they're proud of, what's happening in their personal life. So if the person that you chose that you want to be able to build a little bit of a stronger relationship with happens to be a high C, right? They're going to be relatively quiet. They're going to tend to avoid conversation and dialogue. How can we make sure we get them involved through giving them chances to manage details and pay attention to to quality, but also find ways to really allow them to express themselves in ways that other leaders or people around them may not have, right? So give them that chance. I'll do one more here and then I'll pop up another Mentimeter question. And so on this particular side, we're looking at what is the emotion that each of these respective styles feels under stress, or what are some of the things that actually limit them in their own growth and development. And so when we think about trust and building these relationships with each of these respective styles, there's always the possibility that if we expose information about ourselves, that it can lead us to being taken advantage of. That is always the possibility. There's always the possibility of stress or being hurt. But in order to build really deep relationships, we have to be able to offer up some of that vulnerability first, even if it enables somebody else to possibly take advantage of us, but we just have to do it, right? It's the thing, once we have more personal dialogue, more vulnerability, it really gets us to the point of being able to have a deep relationship through being courageous. So if we offer a vulnerability, the likelihood is that someone else around us will do the same. And then it's a spiral, right? The more vulnerability that you offer, the more information that you offer, the more likely they are to offer it back. So if we ever get into a stressful place, and you can see under dominance in the upper left, that when it gets to a point of a person who is high dominance is in a stressful place, they're automatically going to respond with anger. And so it's just a default style of being an extrovert and thinking that the world is out to get you, right? Because they view the environment around them unfavorably. So they're going to default to micromanagement or control. And there's always ways around it, but that's just kind of their default style. So what we have to do is help them see that they've not lost control. So my work here with these folks is always to remind them about all of the other things in their lives that have not changed. And so even if they've lost control in one small piece of their life, 95% of their life or more in other areas is probably still the same. So let them vent their anger, let them get it out, but then also remind them about the various pieces that they still have control over, and that will make them feel better. So the way that the dominance person and that their brain is hardwired is that they can be impatient and that they don't necessarily like routines. But if we surround them with other really hard workers that tend to get a lot of stuff done, that's going to make the high dominance person feel better, right? They're going to feel like they're part of a team that's actually accomplishing something, because the high dominance person loves to be able to accomplish tasks and goals. So surround them with other people who are relatively hard workers that can really take direction from the high dominance and really accomplish some sort of a big team goal. It matters. So the influence in the upper right-hand corner, the yellow box, right? When it comes to stress, these folks, because they're so optimistic, they love fun, they love relationships, they love being in collaborative environments, they default to optimism, right? Even if they're really frustrated, really sad, really angry, whatever it is, they're going to display, right? They're going to display optimism to you. And so sometimes when I'm interacting with a person who defaults to this style, I have to remind them that they can't optimistically overcome everything that's happened in their life. Sometime inherent in any of those learnings or any of those stressful situations, there's a learning in there that they need for something that's going to come later in their life. So if one of the people that you're struggling to communicate with or you would like to be better happens to be high influence, whenever you see them defaulting to optimism, especially under stress, pull them off to the side and ask them questions about what are the things that they're learning in that moment that they can then use later to better themselves or better other people around them. And I think that would be tremendously helpful. Now, they're limited a little bit by, they tend to be really trusting of other people. And so they can make impulsive decisions. They can sometimes be disorganized, but the key is that they tend to be too trusting, and it can come back to hurt them in any number of ways. And so I've seen this happen in a lot of different cases where I've worked with an accounting firm for quite some time. One of their principals happens to be a high I, on the disc. And because the organization hadn't established specific processes yet for some of the tasks that they were doing, this leader got really trusting of one of the new hires without going through a really thorough training. And then all of a sudden, without that acculturation, that new hire just was kind of, because the leader had just trusted the new hire to do whatever he or she needed to do, that person ended up going off and doing things completely not related to what it was that was charged with. And so that employee ended up having to be let go. So part of it is that the high influence person offered too much trust on the front side. Part of it is that there wasn't an organization of process to make sure that there was something specific to be followed. So we have to make sure is that if we're talking to a high influence person, is that they're surrounded somehow by repeatable processes, things that they can default to, so that they know that they don't have to just continually offer trust to somebody. They can take that step back and say, let's complete the process, right? Let's stay focused in on the process. That way they can accomplish the goals that they need to. Now, the steadiness folks in the lower right-hand corner, when it gets to be really stressful for them, they tend to not be emotional at all, right? They're great at the poker face. So what we have to do is pull emotions and feelings and opinions out of them. So help them see in some way, shape, or form that their opinion genuinely matters, right? So if that's you kind of putting on the coaching hat and asking good how, what, and why questions of them to slowly but softly build that relationship and get them to share more stuff, then that's really important. So important to recognize and understand that. Now the C folks, the compliance folks, when it gets to be really stressful, they have a tendency to default to fear, right? And I'm this guy, right? Because I'm a high C on the disc, is that I have to constantly be reminded how my expertise is actually benefiting the team or helping somebody around me, because I can be defensive, or I can isolate myself, or I can be overly critical of myself. So I'm constantly looking for opportunities to be surrounded by systems of praise. And there are lots of ways that it happens inside organizations. It can be recommendations and testimonials on LinkedIn, or it can be different points and things, different rewards that exist within an organization. But just important to see that if you have a high C somewhere in your life, make sure that we surround them with systems of praise and give them feedback in a meaningful way. Now, I'll give you one quick question here by a Mentimeter, and I want you to think about the body language of an S, and I've just gone through and described the steadiness folks. And I want you to think about which of these four descriptions best describes an S, right? Those steadiness folks. So take a look at those four, and which one do you think best describes them? Okay, I see a few responses coming in. So it looks like the way that they've been ordered thus far, right, is the person smiles often. Maybe they have expressive gestures. Looks like the second one, smaller gestures, relaxed. No right or wrong answer, just interested to see what it is that you guys think or feel. So I'll give you another 10 seconds or so. Okay, so it looks like we are gravitating a little bit towards that the person smiles often, and possibly second, that the person has smaller gestures and is relaxed with a relatively easy pace. Let me pop my slides back up and we can see which one. And so if you look in the lower right-hand corner, the body language of a steadiness person in the green area there, smaller gestures, relaxed, walks with an easy pace. So they tend to be just a bit more introverted. Now, let me go through these a little bit quicker, just because I know we got about 10 minutes left in our time together. Now, in the upper left-hand corner, the high dominance people, right? If this is one of those persons that you would like to communicate with a little bit better, recognize that they are going to communicate in a strong way. They're going to be very clear. They're going to speak in a fast-paced manner. And one of the best things that we can do for them is give them opportunities to lead other people. So think about that for the people around you. If you have a high dominance person, can we give them a chance to lead? Now, their body language is very much about being direct, being quick, being really engaged for a short period of time to be able to get something done. Now, if we're negotiating with them or having conversation with them, we don't want to touch them, even professionally. We want to sit on the opposite side of the table. Remember, they fear vulnerability, so we always want to make sure that we create that safe place for them to be able to communicate in the way that they want to. Now, in the yellow box in the upper right-hand corner, influence, these folks, remember, they're people-oriented, very extroverted. They're going to be animated. They're going to be really friendly. They're going to have a sense of humor. They're going to want to have fun. So they do really well in organizations in marketing and sales and kind of high touch with client roles. You're going to see them smiling a lot. They're going to be very expressive in their gestures. One of the great things about the influence folks is that they get so involved in a conversation is that they don't realize that when they're walking, they weave side to side. So whenever I'm with a high influence person, I always have to step back about a step or a half a step to make sure that they don't bump into me. But they're okay with a professional touch, and you can sit next to them at a table just to make sure that they feel safe. It makes them feel a little bit easier to be able to have dialogue with you. And as we just mentioned in the lower right-hand corner, those folks that are high steadiness, they tend to be a little bit more methodical or have a lower tone of voice, but they're great, as I said earlier, about being the glue that keeps an organization together. So if there's an operations role or a human resources role, they would do really good in that specific place. Now, just like the high I people, they're okay to touch as long as you're sitting adjacent to them at a table, and they're going to be a little bit less expressive with their gestures. So they're going to be more relaxed and probably walk with an easier pace. So maybe you recognize those folks in your life. Now, in the lower left-hand corner, the compliance piece. So somebody who is a higher C, right, they can be a little bit more deliberate and precise with their tone. They do great in accounting or engineering roles. And that's not a stereotype of everybody that communicates that way, but just gravitationally for all the DISC assessments that I've done for teams across the nation, there seems to be a preponderance of folks that are in accounting or engineering that gravitate towards C and sometimes S communication styles. But the body language of a high compliance person, right, they are okay with direct eye contact. They're not going to have as many nonverbal gestures, and they do like to walk in a straight line. And like the D, it's best to sit on the opposite side of the table from them so that they feel safe to be able to express themselves. So like Sherry just said via chat, right, these are not hard and fast, if you will, per style. We can display different characteristics of each of them, but it is important to understand that you have a tendency towards one or the other, depending on which ones are higher for you. And that's going to be true of the people that are around you as well. So the last slide here that I'll share about these different things when it comes to these styles, and then I'll let you go here pretty soon, is when we think about the verbal, nonverbal stuff for the dominance and influence, steadiness, compliance, like in the upper left-hand corner, each of them has a respective conflict style or negotiation style. And in the handout that I gave you, I described some of these things in a little bit more depth. But when we think about conflict, right, the high dominance person, right, I shared earlier that they enjoy winning. So when it comes to negotiation or conflict, they're going to want to be competitive, right? Because it gives them joy to be assertive with their own needs, but they're not necessarily going to be as cooperative with someone else's needs. So they're going to go for like a win-lose scenario, right? So the way that we can make sure we communicate really well with a high dominance person is we give them options. Sometimes we can flatter their ego a little bit, but it's great if we ask for their opinion so that they feel like their opinion's being heard. So important to recognize that there are little strategies and tactics that you can use to make those other persons feel safe so they're not stressed or we're not evoking their fear. And for the dominance folks, it's giving them options, right? That really helps them to feel like they're participating. Now, in the upper right-hand corner, those folks that are high I influence, they are far more collaborative. So when it comes to conflict, they want a win-win resolution. So not only are they assertive in getting what it is that they want out of the dialogue, but they also genuinely want to get your perspective too. So they're much more cooperative. So the best way to communicate with them is to have some social time first, 5, 10, 15 minutes, and then you can talk business after you've done the social stuff. So if you share some personal stories, that's great. Don't spend a lot of time in the details with these people. Put the details in an email later, and that will help them to trust you really quickly and really rapidly. Now, the lower right-hand corner steadiness, they tend to be very accommodating when it comes to conflict. So they don't express themselves and not assertive with what it is that they need, but they're highly cooperative with what other people around them might need. So the way that we can make them feel safe and to not trigger their fears is give them a slow process when we're in conflict or negotiation and give them lots of facts and data as to why we need to do something specifically, right? That will help tremendously to make them feel safe. Now, similarly, for the C in the lower left-hand corner, when it comes to conflict, maybe you have this person on your team or in your life who really just avoids conversation or conflict, right? They're not assertive in expressing themselves, but they're also not cooperative in understanding what it is that someone else really needs. So we want to make sure that we share with them that there's possibly a loss if they continue to push off the decision, but also if they make the decision faster, it will minimize some risk and we can give them some more opportunities to answer questions just to make them feel safe. So these folks are constantly struggling to make decisions because they're looking for more data, right? They're looking for more expertise. They're looking for more assurance. So with any DIS or C style, there's various things that we can do to set some sort of an expectation and build that trust. And here's, various things that we can be doing to make sure that we really find a way to not only know ourselves, but also then understand some of those underlying factors or those things that we can look for verbally and non-verbally that help us know how to adjust our style to the person close to us. So I want you to think about, I'm going to grab your phone for the last Mentimeter question. And when you think about everything that we just talked to, the various DISC styles, is there something that you want to do next? Like what's an action item for you? Is it to take a DISC assessment? Is it to read the chapter that I sent to you via email this morning? Is it to do a bit more journaling and reflection about somebody in your life? That you think that you would take away from today's decision and then go do something with it. And you can freeform your response there. So anything that you've been thinking about through this, you're welcome to respond with. Okay, so a few things that have come in. Let's read the chapter. So that's chapter 4 of my book, I Know. I'll talk about I Know just here in a second. Read the email and the journal. So keep it as a resource and reference it often. That's a good one. And then so somebody was also kind enough to say that, that he or she wants to get their wife to take it, which is good. Somebody wants to take the DISC assessment. And one of the things that I offered to everybody was that if you wanted to do TTI's version of the DISC, I could administer that for you for $75. And so if that's interesting to you, I think the normal retail is, probably $250 or $275. But I'm happy to do it for $75 if you're interested. So you just email me when we're done and I can get that to you. So thank you for responding to that. And so when you think about what it is that you can do, right, there is no right or wrong DISC style. But what's really important, again, is back to self-awareness and back to this point of recognizing another person. But the way that we do that is not overnight. It takes time. So if you look on the left-hand side and you work yourself to the right, we want to choose that one person that we're struggling to communicate with. And then under track, we want to make sure that we keep a journal for a couple of weeks. What are his or her verbal or nonverbal cues that we see happen over and over and over again? So then the third step is, how do we reflect, right? How do we compare what it is that we've just journaled and the patterns that we're finding in that person's behavior to chapter 4 of my book, or to some other resource, or to the DISC assessment if you wanted to complete it, so that we were very clear on what his or her style might be. Then the fourth step is about iteration. How do we adjust or change our strategy and our style to not only tailor our communication to him or her in a way that makes us be much more trusted by that person and by that style, especially if we have a really different style to him or her. So then after you've done that for 2 or 3 weeks and you want to try it with another person in your life, that's what the fifth step about optimization is about. How do you repeat this process again with a different DISC style, so that you keep building an awareness or a knowledge about what it really takes to not only be self-aware, but also to adjust your style to the various DISC styles that are out there, because there are so many different ways that this can manifest in a person's life. But if you really genuinely want to get to the point of being a memorable leader or being a great friend, whatever those things are, then this is probably a really, really great way to do it. And before I let you go, I want to just make one quick mention. I'm sure a handful of you have read this book, and you can see "I know" on the left-hand side of the screen. But this, when we began today's talk, I gave that quick quote from Green about that really trust is a tango, right? It's a relationship between yourself and this other person. And the book that I wrote, I really am the trustor, if you will, in that I'm exposing myself in my life's journey and various things. I tell client stories in the book, and I expose myself to some level of risk. But I view the reader of the book, or the listener, right, because it's also available in audiobook, as being like the trustee, right? You can pull from its pages a bunch of knowledge that you can then utilize to then be authentically vulnerable in your own way. So the book tells a lot about my story, very raw, very authentic. And it really, at the very beginning, you'll learn a little bit about my desire to commit suicide and the various things that I was struggling with about 2 years ago, and the various things that I was able to do in the summer thereafter to kind of get back to a place of safety and security for myself. So it really is about empowering anybody to transition from believing life's answers come from outside of themselves to coming from inside yourself. And the book is 9 processes that anybody can go through to really let go of loss, or figure out a way to do some emotional release, but then also move into an emotional neutral zone, where chapter 4, 5, and 6, which you now have chapter 4, you can really think about your personal brand and what it is that makes you you. So I want you to think about this book as being a how-to guide that moves somebody through the 3 phases of personal transformation. And the 9 processes in there are really meant to help you, by the end of it, feel great and confident about your life, finding that work-life integration, finding your purpose, and really living life at a completely different level, right? It really matters a lot. So a lot of places that you can find the book if you're interested. And I'll leave you with the quote from George MacDonald. It's to be trusted is a greater compliment than being loved. And I really do quote. So in the short period of time that we've been together today, we got to learn a little bit about the history DISC in Marston back in the 1920s, but then also in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, Bill Bonster, and how he personalized the DISC report and has done this 39 times across the globe. Talked a little bit about trust, right? And that really is about those integrity-driven behaviors, finding a way to act really honestly and in a dependable manner. We got to define the DISC a little bit and go through those things. So I hope that I was able to help you looking at, each of these kind of verbal and nonverbal cues to really get to the point of self-awareness, or to recognize others, or how do you intentionally adjust your style to someone else in a really meaningful way. So when we think about our growth, your growth, it's really dependent upon your daily habits and the things that you're willing to do day after day. If it's a journal, if it's experimenting with one of the different suggestions from the slide deck or from chapter 4 of the book, really reflecting on that learning and really getting to that point of continual growth, it really does matter tremendously. So I'll open up chat here real quick just to see if there's anything in here that I can help with. Didn't see anything in there, but do you all have any comments or questions, anything that I can help with before I let you go? You're welcome to unmute yourself or put it into chat if you wish.
Great review of the information, Michael.
Thank you, Sherry.
Yeah, really good, because it always opens up something else for me every time I see it.
Yeah, thank you.